A helping hand in the midst of struggles. Ethan Marshall sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he let out a tired sigh. The engine of his aging sedan hummed softly, the rhythmic noise offering little comfort to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. The stack of overdue bills on the passenger seat taunted him, a constant reminder of how precarious his situation had become. Rent was due in a week, his utility bills were piling up, and his latest delivery shifts barely covered groceries. But none of that mattered right now. Not when he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the most important person in his life, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. "Daddy, can we get ice cream after school?" she asked, her voice hopeful, her bright blue eyes shining with innocence. Ethan forced a smile, though his heart ached. He wanted nothing more than to say yes without hesitation, to take her to the ice cream shop like he used to when times were better. But now, even small indulgences felt like luxuries he couldn't afford. "Maybe this weekend, sweetheart," he said, reaching back to ruffle her golden curls. "We'll have a special treat, okay?" Lily pouted slightly but nodded. "Okay, Daddy." Ethan sighed and turned his focus to the road, maneuvering through the familiar streets toward Lily's elementary school. The car rattled slightly over a pothole, a grim reminder that it, too, needed repairs, another expense he couldn't afford. As he pulled up in front of the school, something caught his attention. Across the street, an elderly woman was struggling with a large cardboard box, her frail frame bending under its weight. She wore a beige cardigan, despite the warm morning, and her silver hair was neatly pulled back into a bun. "Daddy, why is that lady carrying such a big box?" Lily asked, her voice filled with concern. Ethan hesitated. He was already cutting it close for his next shift, and every minute counted. But as he watched the woman nearly stumble under the weight, something in him stirred, a deep-rooted instinct, perhaps to do the right thing. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back," he said as he turned off the engine and stepped out. The woman was struggling to balance the box on her hip when Ethan reached her side. "Ma'am, let me help you with that," he offered, already reaching for the box. She looked up, startled, before relief softened her expression. "Oh, bless you, young man. I thought I could manage, but it's heavier than I expected." Ethan took the box from her arms and was surprised by its weight. It was packed with old books. "Where do you need this?" he asked, adjusting his grip. "Just inside my house." She gestured to a modest, aging home a few steps away. "If you don't mind." "Not at all," Ethan said, following her toward the house. As they stepped inside, he was hit with the scent of lavender and aged wood. The walls were lined with framed photographs, each telling a story of a life long lived. He carefully set the box down near the entrance. "Thank you so much, young man," she said, brushing her hands against her cardigan. "I'm Eleanor Bennett. I'm trying to sort through some things for donation, but it's slow going these days." Ethan smiled politely, though his mind was already drifting to the clock ticking away on his shift. "Happy to help. If you ever need an extra hand, just let me know." Eleanor's eyes lit up, but there was hesitation in her voice. "That's very kind of you. I don't want to impose, but if you're sure, do you have a phone number? Just in case." Ethan hesitated for a brief moment. Between his delivery job, odd carpentry gigs, and raising Lily, his plate was already overflowing. But something about Eleanor reminded him of his own grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents passed away. He sighed and scribbled his number onto a notepad she handed him. "Call me if you need anything, Mrs. Bennett," he said as he headed back to his car. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Lily tilted her head. "Why did you help her, Daddy?" Ethan started the car and glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Because it's the right thing to do, Lily. Sometimes people just need a little help." She nodded thoughtfully, her small hands gripping her backpack as she mulled over his words. That evening, as Ethan sat at his tiny kitchen table, sifting through unpaid bills, his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. "Hello," he answered, already bracing himself for the worst. Maybe another overdue payment reminder. "Ethan, this is Eleanor Bennett," the voice on the other end said, hesitant yet warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," he said, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. "I hate to trouble you, but I have a cabinet door that's come loose, and my porch light isn't working. I was wondering if you might know how to fix them." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. He was exhausted, and another errand was the last thing he needed. But then he thought of Eleanor's house, the loneliness in her eyes, the way she had struggled with that heavy box. She reminded him of someone who had spent too many years doing everything alone. "I can take a look. When would you like me to stop by?" he asked. "If you're free tomorrow afternoon, that would be wonderful." He agreed, though a small part of him wondered if he'd regret taking on yet another responsibility. The next afternoon, Ethan arrived at Eleanor's house, toolbox in hand. Lily had insisted on coming along, so she sat cross-legged on the porch with a coloring book while he worked on the cabinet. "This door just needed a new screw," Ethan said as he tightened the hinge. Eleanor, sitting nearby with a cup of tea, smiled warmly. "You're quite handy, Ethan. Did you learn that somewhere?" "I used to be an apprentice carpenter," he said without looking up. "Had to quit when Lily was born. Life got complicated." "I see," she said gently. "You're doing a wonderful job raising her." Ethan paused, glancing at Lily, who was humming to herself as she colored. "Thanks. It's not always easy, but she's worth it." By the time he finished replacing the porch light, the sun was starting to set. Eleanor handed him a plate of cookies wrapped in foil. "For Lily," she said with a wink. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," Ethan said, genuinely touched. "Call me Eleanor," she replied. As they walked back to the car, Lily clutched the plate of cookies like a treasure. "Mrs. Bennett is nice," she said. "Yes, she is," Ethan agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that she was lonelier than she let on. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Eleanor. "Thank you for helping me today. I'm grateful to have met someone as kind as you." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Anytime, Eleanor. Let me know if you need anything else." As he set the phone down and exhaled, he realized something. Life wasn't getting any easier, but helping Eleanor had brought a strange sense of peace. Maybe Lily was right. Mrs. Bennett was nice. And maybe, just maybe, she needed help just as much as he did. The bonds that form in silence. The morning air was crisp as Ethan parked his car outside Eleanor's home once again. The sun had barely begun its slow climb over the horizon, casting golden light through the trees lining the quiet neighborhood. Beside him in the passenger seat, Lily swung her legs back and forth, her small hands clutching a Tupperware container full of homemade muffins. "Do you think Mrs. Bennett will like these, Daddy?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Ethan glanced at his daughter and smiled. "I think she'll love them. You did a great job helping me make them." Lily beamed with pride. "I wanted to make her something special. She gives me cookies, so I want to give her something too." The simple innocence in her words made Ethan's chest tighten. He reached over, gently squeezing her tiny hand. "That's very sweet of you, sweetheart." As they stepped out of the car, Ethan took a deep breath. It had been a long week, filled with endless deliveries, unexpected car trouble, and the ever-present weight of unpaid bills. Yet, somehow, coming here didn't feel like another chore. It felt different, like something he wanted to do. Lily skipped ahead, her curls bouncing with each step. She knocked eagerly on Eleanor's front door before Ethan even had the chance to reach the porch. The door creaked open, revealing Eleanor in her usual beige cardigan and a warm yet slightly surprised expression. "Lily, Ethan, what a lovely surprise," she said, stepping back to let them inside. Lily held out the container with both hands. "We made you muffins." Eleanor's eyes softened as she took the offering, peeking inside. "Oh, these look wonderful. Did you make these yourself?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy helped. But I mixed the batter, and I put the blueberries in." "Well, I can't wait to try them," Eleanor said, leading them into the house. Ethan stepped inside, already noticing a slight change from the last time he was here. The house, though still filled with remnants of a long and well-lived life, seemed less lonely. Maybe it was the way Eleanor smiled more easily now. Maybe it was the way she had tidied up the living room, as if expecting company. Or maybe, Ethan thought, it was because she finally had company. "Come, sit," Eleanor urged, motioning toward the small dining table in the kitchen. "I was just about to make tea." Ethan pulled out a chair, while Lily climbed into hers with eager excitement. "I like tea," she announced. Eleanor chuckled as she set the kettle on the stove. "Well, then, you're in for a treat. I have a special kind of tea, chamomile with honey. It's very good." Lily nodded sagely. "I think tea is fancy." Ethan chuckled at that. "Fancy, huh? Well, I guess we're having a very fancy breakfast then." As they sat and ate, the conversation flowed easily. Eleanor told stories about her late husband, Charles, how they had built this house together nearly 50 years ago. "He loved working with his hands," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Built all the shelves in this house himself. He always said that a home should be made with love, not just bricks and wood." Ethan nodded, understanding that sentiment more than he could explain. He had always loved carpentry, the feeling of creating something strong and useful with his own two hands. But life had taken him down a different road, one where making ends meet had taken priority over passion. As if reading his thoughts, Eleanor glanced at him with knowing eyes. "You miss it, don't you?" Ethan blinked. "Miss what?" "Building things," she said simply. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I do." Eleanor sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Then maybe you should start again." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Easier said than done. Carpentry isn't exactly a stable income, and right now I can't afford to take risks." Eleanor nodded but didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "Sometimes, the things we think we can't do are the very things we need to do." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. After breakfast, Eleanor stood and dusted off her hands. "Now, I didn't ask you over just for tea and muffins. I actually do have something I need help with." Ethan smirked. "Somehow, I knew there was a reason you were being so nice to us." Eleanor laughed. "Oh, hush. It's nothing major. Just a wobbly shelf in my study. I think it's about to fall off the wall." Ethan stood, stretching his arms. "All right, let's take a look." Lily clapped her hands. "Can I help, Daddy?" "Of course, kiddo. My little assistant never takes a day off." Eleanor led them down the hall to a cozy study lined with bookshelves. The room smelled of old paper and lavender, and Ethan could tell this was where Eleanor spent most of her time. One of the shelves on the far wall was indeed tilting slightly, the screws in the brackets barely holding it in place. Ethan examined it carefully. "Yeah, this needs new anchors. Otherwise, it's just going to keep coming loose." Eleanor smiled. "Well, good thing I have my very own handyman here." Ethan set to work while Lily handed him tools from his kit, playing the role of assistant with great seriousness. As he drilled in new anchors and reinforced the brackets, Eleanor sat nearby, watching them with an expression that was both warm and wistful. "You know, this house has been awfully quiet these past few years," she said softly. "But ever since you two started coming around, it feels different." Ethan glanced at her. "Different how?" She smiled. "Lively, warmer, like a home again." Something in Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't realized just how much their visits had meant to her. And if he was being honest, he hadn't realized how much she had come to mean to them. By the time Ethan finished securing the shelf, the study looked sturdier, less like a place frozen in time and more like a space ready to be used again. "All done," he announced, dusting off his hands. Eleanor stood and ran her fingers along the newly secured shelf. Perfect. Thank you, Ethan. Anytime, he said. Lily grinned up at Eleanor. Can we come back again? Eleanor's expression softened. Of course, dear. You two are always welcome. As they packed up to leave, Eleanor walked them to the door. Ethan, she said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I meant what I said earlier. You should think about going back to carpentry. Ethan exhaled. I'll think about it. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Good, because I have a feeling that your hands were meant to build more than just shelves. As they drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily, who was happily humming a tune. You like visiting Mrs. Bennet, huh? He asked. Lily nodded eagerly. She's like a grandma, but with better cookies. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. As much as he had stepped in to help Eleanor, he was starting to realize something. Maybe, just maybe, she was helping him too. Seeds of change. Ethan found himself in a strange place, one where exhaustion didn't just feel like a burden, but a reminder of something meaningful. The past few weeks had been long, filled with deliveries that barely covered bills and sleepless nights staring at payment notices. But something had shifted. His hands, once used to only steering wheels and grocery bags, were now covered in sawdust and the faint scent of freshly cut wood. The feeling of repairing something, making it whole again, had awakened something inside him. And Eleanor Bennet had noticed. That was why, on this bright Saturday morning, Ethan found himself pulling up to her house once more, not out of obligation, not because he needed a break from life's struggles, but because, strangely enough, it felt like a place where his heart could breathe. Daddy, do you think the sunflowers grew yet? Lily asked from the back seat, practically bouncing in her seat. Ethan chuckled as he cut the engine. Well, we planted them 2 weeks ago, kiddo. They might still be little. Lily huffed dramatically. I want them to be big already. Ethan grinned. Patience, sweetheart. Things take time to grow. As they stepped out of the car, Eleanor was already waiting on the porch, her warm smile greeting them like an old friend. Lily. Ethan. She called, waving them over. You're right on time. Right on time for what? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Eleanor smirked. You'll see. She led them through the house and into the backyard, where the remnants of their last gardening project stood proudly. The once overgrown space was starting to show signs of revival. The bird bath stood straighter, its stone surface no longer lost beneath weeds. The trellis Ethan had fixed was still standing, waiting for vines to climb it once more. But what caught Lily's attention was the small patch of soil near the fence, where tiny green sprouts poked through the dirt. They grew. Lily squealed, racing over to them. Look, Daddy. They're babies. Eleanor chuckled. They sure are. And with some time, they'll stretch toward the sun, just like you wanted. Lily dropped to her knees, gently touching the fragile stems. Can we water them? Ethan smiled. Of course. Eleanor handed Lily a small watering can, and she set to work with great determination. Ethan watched her, a quiet warmth settling in his chest. She's got a good heart, Eleanor said softly beside him. She does, Ethan agreed. Better than I deserve. Eleanor turned to him with a knowing look. You ever think maybe you're too hard on yourself? Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. I feel like I should be doing more. More for Lily. More for myself. Eleanor studied him for a moment before motioning toward a wooden bench near the garden. Sit with me. Ethan hesitated but eventually followed her, sinking into the worn wood. He hadn't realized how tired he was until he let himself rest. You know, Eleanor started, clasping her hands in her lap, when Charles and I bought this house, it was nothing but an empty shell. No garden, no flowers, just dirt and dust. Ethan listened as she spoke, her voice rich with memory. But we saw something in it, she continued. Potential. Something worth building. So, piece by piece, brick by brick, we made it a home. She turned to him then, her blue eyes sharp despite her age. And I see that in you, Ethan. Ethan blinked. See what? Eleanor smiled. Potential. He let out a small, dry laugh. I don't know about that. Well, I do, she said firmly. You have something most people don't. A good heart. Hands that know how to build. A soul that doesn't turn away when someone needs help. Ethan shook his head. That doesn't pay the bills. Eleanor sighed, but there was no frustration in it. Only patience. Maybe not right now. But it could. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She tilted her head toward the backyard. You fixed that trellis with nothing but some old tools and a bit of determination. You've repaired my cabinets, my porch light, my shelves, all with skill that most people would have charged an arm and a leg for. Ethan shrugged. It's just fixing things. No, Ethan. It's building things. Eleanor turned fully toward him now. You say you want to do more. So, why not start now? Ethan exhaled. It's not that simple, Eleanor. I can't just quit everything and hope for the best. Who said you have to quit? She countered. You start small. A few jobs here and there. Word of mouth spreads fast. Before you know it, you could have something steady. Ethan opened his mouth to argue but found that he couldn't. Because deep down, something about her words felt right. He had always loved working with his hands, loved the satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole again. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start believing that he could build more than just furniture. Maybe he could rebuild his life. Think about it, Eleanor said gently. You don't have to decide now. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, I'll think about it. Good, she said with a knowing smile, because I might just have a job for you. Ethan arched a brow. Oh. Eleanor stood, brushing off her cardigan. Come with me. Ethan followed her into the house, down the hall to a small, rarely used room. The space was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of books, and forgotten memories. This was Charles' workshop, Eleanor said, running her fingers along a dust-covered workbench. He built everything in this house right here. Ethan glanced around, taking in the old tools, the half-finished project still waiting for completion. I've been holding on to it for years, Eleanor admitted, but I think it's time it's used again. Ethan frowned. What are you saying? Eleanor turned to him with a gentle smile. I want you to have it. Ethan's breath caught. What? Eleanor, I can't. Yes, you can, she interrupted. I want you to use it, to build again. Ethan swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside him. Eleanor, this is too much. She reached for his hands, clasping them in hers. Ethan, you've given me something I haven't had in a long time. Company. Purpose. A reason to wake up and look forward to the day. Let me give you something in return. Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a room. It was a second chance. A fresh start. He exhaled, his hands tightening around hers. I don't know what to say. Eleanor smiled. Say yes. Ethan let out a shaky breath. And then, for the first time in years, he did. A blueprint for the future. Ethan stood at the threshold of Eleanor's late husband's workshop, his breath catching in his throat. The room smelled of aged wood, oil, and time itself. Dust covered every surface, but beneath it all, Ethan saw something more. Potential. This wasn't just a room. This was a chance. His hands ran over the workbench, his fingertips tracing the outlines of tools long left untouched. Hammers, chisels, saws, each one a piece of a past life, a past dream. He could almost see the ghost of Charles Bennett working here, bent over his projects, crafting something out of nothing. Eleanor stood beside him, watching him carefully. It's yours if you want it, Ethan. He swallowed hard, shaking his head. Eleanor, this is too much. I can't just take this. She chuckled softly. Who said you're taking it? You're using it. This place has been sitting here, gathering dust. I can't work in it, and Charles wouldn't have wanted it to go to waste. She gave him a pointed look. You need this, Ethan. Ethan's hands curled into fists. The idea of taking anything, accepting help, made his stomach twist. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for things. He worked, struggled, fought for every inch of ground. But this was given to him. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of working odd jobs, fixing things, lifting, carrying. These hands had built a life for Lily the best way they could. But maybe, just maybe, they could do more. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. Eleanor smiled. I'm very sure. Ethan exhaled and nodded. Okay. For the first time in years, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was going to build again. Starting over. The following days were a whirlwind of movement. Ethan spent every spare moment cleaning out the workshop, restoring it piece by piece. The dust was thick. The wood warped in some places, but the bones of the place were strong, just like him. Lily helped where she could, though most of her help involved making sawdust castles on the floor. Eleanor would sit in her chair by the door, watching with amusement as Ethan lost himself in the work. You look different, she noted one afternoon. Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Different how? She smiled. Lighter, like you're breathing again. Ethan thought about that. Maybe she was right. For so long, life had been about surviving. Working long shifts, barely scraping by, always worrying about the next bill, the next emergency. He had forgotten what it was like to do something simply because it made him happy. And carpentry. It made him happy. By the end of the week, the workshop was nearly unrecognizable. The tools were cleaned, the workbenches sanded down, the air no longer thick with dust, but filled with the scent of fresh wood. Lily ran in, holding a small wooden heart in her hands. Look what I made, Daddy. Ethan knelt, taking it from her. The edges were uneven, the shape slightly crooked, but to him, it was perfect. This is amazing, sweetheart, he said, hugging her. Lily grinned. Mrs. Bennet helped me. Eleanor chuckled. She has a good eye for shapes. Might have a future as a carpenter herself. Ethan's chest swelled with pride. He was doing something right. The first job. Eleanor wasn't just giving Ethan a space to work. She was giving him something even more valuable. Connections. I have a friend, Mrs. Callahan, she told him one morning. She's been complaining about her kitchen cabinets falling apart. I mentioned that you're quite handy, and she'd love to hire you to fix them. Ethan hesitated. You told her I'd do it. Eleanor arched a brow. Of course. You can do it, can't you? He sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, I can. You just what? She prompted. Ethan looked down. I haven't done this in a long time, Eleanor. What if I mess up? She snorted. Ethan, you rebuilt half my house in the past few weeks. You're not going to mess up some cabinets. Lily bounced on her feet. Daddy, you should do it. You love fixing things. Ethan looked between them, the old woman who believed in him, and the little girl who needed him to believe in himself. He exhaled. All right, I'll do it. A small beginning, the big step. Mrs. Callahan's kitchen was a disaster. The cabinet doors were loose, the shelves tilted at an angle, and half the drawers barely opened. This house is older than I am, the elderly woman huffed. It's falling apart one piece at a time. Ethan smiled, rolling up his sleeves. Well, let's see if we can stop that from happening. The job took longer than expected, but once Ethan was done, the kitchen looked new. He tightened every hinge, replaced old screws, and reinforced the shelves. By the time he was finished, Mrs. Callahan was nearly in tears. This is the first time my cabinets have actually closed properly in years, she marveled, running her fingers over the wood. Ethan shrugged. Just needed some care. Mrs. Callahan reached into her purse, pulling out an envelope. Here, young man, for your time. Ethan took it hesitantly. You didn't have to. She gave him a look. I did. This is work, Ethan. You deserve to be paid for it. He nodded slowly, slipping the envelope into his pocket. As he walked out of the house, Lily ran up to him. Daddy, did she like it? Ethan picked her up, spinning her in the air. She loved it. Eleanor chuckled, watching from her chair. Told you. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Okay, you were right. She smirked. You'll get used to saying that. Dreams rebuilt. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope in his hands. When he opened it, he nearly choked. $200. For the first time in a long time, he had made money doing something he loved. And suddenly, everything felt possible. He looked at Lily, fast asleep on the couch, her little wooden heart still clutched in her hand. Then he looked at his own hands, rough, strong, capable. Hands meant to build. Not just furniture, not just houses, but a future. And for the first time, he was ready, laying the foundation for a new life. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of Ethan's tiny apartment, casting soft shadows over the worn furniture. A gentle autumn breeze slipped through the open window, rustling the scattered papers on the kitchen table. Ethan sat there, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the lined notebook in front of him. His fingers drummed idly on the surface as he scanned the page filled with scribbles, measurements, and notes. His business plan. It still felt strange thinking about it that way. The business. For years, Ethan had been running from job to job, barely staying afloat. The idea of building something, not just furniture, not just homes, but a life where he and Lily could thrive, had never seemed possible. Until now. Mrs. Callahan's job had been just the beginning. Word spread quickly among the neighborhood's elderly community. Within days, Ethan had received 3 more requests, one for a broken fence, another for a set of uneven stairs, and a third for a custom-built bookshelf. People were calling him. Not an employer. Not some corporation handing out paycheck-to-paycheck work. But him. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he had control over his own future, turning dreams into reality. Eleanor had been watching his progress closely. After his 3rd successful job, she sat him down on her porch with 2 cups of tea and a look that meant business. Ethan, she started, handing him a warm mug. It's time you started charging what you're worth. Ethan took a sip, barely suppressing a chuckle. I am charging, Eleanor. She rolled her eyes. You're charging like you're doing people favors, not like you're running a business. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't want to overcharge anyone. There's a difference between fair pricing and selling yourself short, she said, her voice firm but kind. You have a skill, Ethan. One that people need. You're providing a service, and you should be compensated properly. Ethan hesitated. It felt selfish to ask for more money when so many people, like him, were struggling. But then he thought about Lily, about the nights when he skipped dinner so she wouldn't have to, about the shoes she was outgrowing, about the way she always hesitated when asking for small things because she knew money was tight. It wasn't about greed. It was about giving her the life she deserved. Ethan exhaled and nodded. Okay, I'll raise my prices. But not too much. Eleanor smirked. Good. Now, let's talk business. Setting the framework. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's side business began to grow. He printed out simple flyers and left them in local stores. Word spread. And with each job, his confidence grew. He fixed broken porch railings, repaired old squeaky floorboards, built custom furniture that people loved. And with every project, something changed inside him. He wasn't just working anymore. He was creating. For the first time in years, He felt a sense of pride in what he did. He wasn't just a struggling single father barely scraping by. He was a craftsman, a provider, a builder, and he wasn't alone in this journey. Eleanor had become something of a mentor, guiding him through pricing strategies, budgeting, and even how to handle difficult clients. Lily, of course, was his official assistant, which mostly involved handing him tools and collecting payment in the form of extra cookies from Eleanor. But deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't just about business. It was about life. It was about building a future, brick by brick, plank by plank, piece by piece. The challenge that almost broke him. One afternoon, just as Ethan was finishing up a job, his phone buzzed. A new client. Except, this wasn't just any client. This was Mr. Douglas, the man who owned half the rental properties in the neighborhood, a man notorious for being difficult and demanding. The job, an entire kitchen remodel. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the message. This was huge. This wasn't just fixing a railing or replacing cabinets. This was big league work. Work that could change everything for him. But could he do it? Was he ready for this? The doubt crept in immediately. What if he messed up? What if he wasn't good enough? Eleanor must have seen the look on his face because, without a word, she pulled up a chair next to him and handed him a steaming cup of tea. "Talk to me," she said. Ethan exhaled. "It's a big job, Eleanor." She nodded. "So?" He frowned. "So, what if I'm not ready?" Eleanor reached over, patting his hand. "You are ready, Ethan. You've been ready. The only thing stopping you is you." Ethan swallowed hard. Could he really do this? The workshop, the cabinets, the fences, the floors, the railings. He had already done it. He could do this. He would. Ethan took a deep breath, picked up his phone, and accepted the job. Building more than just a kitchen. The project took weeks. Every day, Ethan poured his energy into the remodel, balancing his time between his business, Lily, and late-night planning sessions. It wasn't just about cutting wood or installing counters. It was about proving to himself that he belonged in this world of craftsmanship, that he was more than just a struggling single father, that he was capable of more. The days were long. The nights were longer. But when he finally stepped back, surveying the newly completed kitchen, something inside him settled. It was beautiful. Polished countertops, smooth wooden cabinets, sleek, functional design. It was his best work yet. Mr. Douglas, who was known for being impossible to please, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He inspected every inch, running his fingers along the polished surfaces. For a long moment, he said nothing. Ethan's stomach tightened. Then, finally, Douglas gave a slow nod. "You do good work, Marshall." Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you, sir." Douglas pulled out a checkbook, scribbled something down, and handed it to Ethan. Ethan's eyes widened. It was more money than he had ever made from a single job. More than enough to catch up on all of his bills. More than enough to finally breathe. More than enough to believe. A future built on strength. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the check resting in front of him. Lily leaned over, looking at it curiously. "Is that a lot of money, Daddy?" Ethan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah, sweetheart, it is." She grinned. "Does that mean we can get ice cream now?" Ethan chuckled, pulling her into his arms. "You know what? Yes, we can get all the ice cream you want." As Lily squealed in excitement, Ethan looked out the window, where the city lights flickered in the distance. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something real. For himself. For Lily. For the future. And the best part, he was just getting started. From struggle to strength. Ethan stared at the check, the numbers written in crisp ink, still feeling surreal. It was more money than he had seen in years, not just a payment, but a validation of his work. He ran his thumb over the paper, his mind racing with possibilities. Rent, groceries, school supplies for Lily, maybe even a new, or at least a used but reliable car. For the first time in so long, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel quite so crushing. Across the table, Lily was still bouncing with excitement. "Daddy, can we go now?" Ethan blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. "Go where?" She pouted. "You said we could get all the ice cream I want." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. All right. Ice cream it is." Lily cheered, already running to grab her shoes. Ethan pocketed the check and reached for his phone. There was one more thing he needed to do. One person he needed to call. A debt of gratitude. Eleanor answered on the first ring. "Well, if it isn't my favorite carpenter," she teased. "I assume you have good news." Ethan grinned, shaking his head. "You already knew I'd get the job, didn't you?" "I had no doubt," she said warmly. Ethan exhaled, leaning against the counter. "Eleanor, I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" she asked, genuinely curious. "For everything," Ethan said. "For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For giving me the workshop. For pushing me to take this step." Eleanor was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Ethan, all I did was open a door. You walked through it." Ethan swallowed hard. "Still, I wouldn't be here without you." Eleanor chuckled. "Well, I'm just glad I didn't have to drag you through that door kicking and screaming." Ethan laughed. "You almost did." "I almost did," she admitted. "Now stop wasting time on an old woman like me and go celebrate with your daughter." Ethan smiled. "You know, you could come with us. Lily would love to have you there." Eleanor hesitated. "Oh, I don't know. It's been a while since I've gone out like that." "All the more reason to do it," Ethan countered. "Come on, I'm buying." Eleanor let out a soft laugh. "Oh, fine. But only because I'm not about to let you waste money on overpriced ice cream alone." Ethan grinned. "See you soon, Eleanor." A simple celebration. 15 minutes later, they were sitting in a small family-owned ice cream shop. Lily had 3 scoops of different flavors in front of her, all decorated with sprinkles, whipped cream, and gummy bears. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You did say she could have all the ice cream she wanted." Ethan sighed dramatically. "Yeah, I might have made a mistake." Lily giggled, already digging in. Eleanor's own ice cream was much simpler. Just a single scoop of vanilla. Ethan himself had gone for Rocky Road, something he hadn't had since he was a teenager. For a while, they just sat there, eating, talking, laughing. It felt normal. It felt good. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like a man barely scraping by. He felt like a father, a man with a future, a builder not just of furniture, but of a life worth living. As Lily happily devoured her ice cream, her giggles filling the shop, Ethan glanced at Eleanor. She was watching him with a knowing smile. "What?" he asked. She shrugged. "Nothing. I'm just proud of you, that's all." Ethan exhaled, his chest tightening. It had been a long time since anyone had said those words to him. He nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Eleanor patted his hand. "Keep building, Ethan." He smiled. "I will." And for the first time, he knew it was true. A future built with purpose. The first cool winds of autumn swept through the city, rattling the golden leaves of the oak tree outside Ethan's apartment window. The summer heat had finally faded, replaced by crisp air and the scent of change. And change was exactly what had been happening in Ethan's life. It had been 3 months since his first official job, and in that time, his small carpentry business had grown faster than he ever imagined. What had started as simple home repairs had turned into something much bigger. He was now getting calls every day. People asking for custom bookshelves, kitchen renovations, even entire backyard decks. His name had spread beyond Eleanor's neighborhood. Clients were coming in from across town, willing to pay well for the craftsmanship he provided. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something he had never thought possible. Security. He wasn't just scraping by anymore. He was thriving. The workshop becomes a home. Ethan pushed open the door to the workshop Eleanor had given him, taking in the familiar scent of sawdust and wood polish. The space no longer looked abandoned. The workbenches were clean and organized. Tools hung neatly on the walls. Freshly cut lumber was stacked in one corner, waiting to be shaped into something beautiful. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was his, and it was growing. Ethan had been investing back into his craft, buying better tools, upgrading his materials, even planning to expand the shop out into the backyard with Eleanor's blessing. But more than that, this place represented hope. A new life. A new beginning. Lily ran into the shop, her pigtails bouncing, as she carried a piece of sandpaper. "Daddy, can I help?" Ethan chuckled. "Sweetheart, you already helped. Remember, you picked out the wood for the bookshelf we're making." Lily grinned. "But I want to help more." Ethan sighed dramatically. Fine. You can sand the edges. But be careful, okay?" Lily nodded, taking her task very seriously. Eleanor, watching from the doorway, smiled. "She's got your determination." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "She's got your stubbornness, too." Eleanor laughed. Guilty. She stepped into the workshop, looking around. "I can't believe how much this place has changed. And all because of you." Ethan exhaled, glancing around. "Feels surreal sometimes." "You earned this, Ethan," Eleanor said firmly. "Every bit of it." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. I never thought I'd get here." "You built your way here," Eleanor corrected. "Brick by brick, nail by nail, job by job. You did this." Ethan took a deep breath, looking at Lily, who was happily sanding away. For the first time, he truly believed it. An unexpected offer. Later that evening, after dinner, Ethan was going through his emails when he saw something that made him freeze. Subject: Business Proposal. Expansion Opportunity. He clicked the email, his heart pounding. It was from a local furniture store owner, a man who had seen Ethan's work through word of mouth. He wasn't just offering a commission job. He was offering a partnership, a full-time contract, a chance to expand beyond home repairs and custom builds. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. This was huge. But was he ready? Could he take that next step? He looked at Lily, curled up on the couch, drawing pictures of what she called Daddy's super cool furniture. Then he thought about Eleanor, the workshop, the months of work that had led him here. And for the first time, the answer felt clear. Yes. It was time. The first step towards something bigger. The next morning, Ethan stood outside Eleanor's house, holding a thermos of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. Eleanor opened the door, squinting against the bright morning sun. "You're here early." Ethan handed her the coffee. "I need advice." She took a sip, raising an eyebrow. This must be serious. Ethan pulled out his phone, showing her the email. She read it carefully. When she looked up, there was a knowing gleam in her eye. "You already know what I'm going to say." Ethan sighed. Yeah, you're gonna tell me to go for it." Eleanor smiled. "You should go for it." Ethan hesitated. "But what if I fail?" Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Ethan, listen to me. You already won." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "You built this from nothing," Eleanor said. "Even if this partnership doesn't work out, even if you have to adjust your plans, you won't be starting from zero again. You'll be starting from experience." Ethan swallowed hard. She was right. He wasn't that struggling man anymore. He was a craftsman, a business owner, a father providing for his daughter. He had come too far to turn back now. Ethan took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. With steady hands, he typed out a response. "I'm interested. Let's set up a meeting." And just like that, his life changed again. A legacy in the making. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood in front of a brand new sign outside his workshop. Marshall Woodworks and Home Repair. The partnership had gone through. The furniture store owner had loved his work. And now, Ethan's business was official. He had a website, a growing list of clients, and a real future. Eleanor watched with pride as Ethan ran his hands over the sign. "Looks good." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it does." Lily, standing between them, held up her own hand-drawn version of the sign. "I made a logo. Can we use it?" Ethan chuckled. "We'll put it in the office, sweetheart." Lily beamed. Eleanor wiped at her eyes. "Charles would have been proud of you." Ethan turned to her, his chest tightening. "I hope so." Eleanor squeezed his arm. "I know so." As the sun set over the workshop, his workshop, Ethan looked around. At Lily, his reason for everything. At Eleanor, the woman who had given him more than he could ever repay. At the life he had built with his own 2 hands. And for the first time in years, he wasn't worried about what came next. Because whatever it was, he was ready.